we're dealing with a little bit of microphone difficulties. We may have to have our speakers pass the microphone back and forth to make it a true fireside chat. We have Sofia and Austin. Sofia is the CEO of VidaCher. VidaCher, I'm sorry, not NVIDIA. You'd be up here on your own. VidaCher. She's an actor, producer, storyteller, has told stories all across the world. And then we have Austin, who's a serial entrepreneur, has built and sold a couple of startups, is now here in LA learning to surf. I hear you're not very good. I'm sorry. And they're going to be talking about what it's like to actually run a startup. If you are running a startup, you know some of the things that they're going to talk about. What do you do when you run out of money? What do you do when you're co-founder and you hate each other? And stories like that. So welcome to the stage, Sofia and Austin.
All right.
Thank you, Mike, for having us today. And thank you, Austin, for agreeing to sit under the spotlight, maybe.
It sort of moved a little bit.
Or not. Okay, so I wanted to sort of start off with, let's sort of start off with if you're not getting along with your co-founder. What are your, what's your advice for how to perhaps maybe structure it so that, when, fights come up, which inevitably they will, how can we make sure that, it doesn't end up into World War III? And then the second part of that is, how have you, when you've dealt with co-founders, found ways in which to sort of delegate responsibilities and, make sure that you're not just stepping on each other's toes?
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Good morning.
Great to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, let's talk about founders and the difficulties that we all have with our co-founders. There's no perfect relationship. There's no perfect co-founder. There will be conflict. So you want to prepare yourself for it. And the advice that I give to all of the startups that I work with is come to an agreement when you're first starting out, before you've done any work. Have all those tough conversations. And in fact, write it down, have a founder's agreement, sign it, agree on what your expected contributions are going to be, how much time you're willing to put into it, what the equity split might be, and there's various ways of negotiating what that's going to be. But try as much as possible to have those difficult conversations first. So when you get to a point where you have a conflict, you have this document you go look at and say, like, okay, well, we agreed when we started that this is how we're going to resolve these types of conflicts. It might be, depending on what type of problem you're working on, you may have agreed, okay, well, I'm going to take the process types of conflicts and I will be the decision maker on that if we can't come to an agreement. You might take the content-oriented problems and you've agreed to delegate beforehand, before you ever get into that situation where both of you want something different and you're just kind of at each other's throats. If you find yourself in that situation where you don't have an agreement or you're in some unexpected conflict there, you want to try to be as transparent with each other as possible. Be respectful of each other's emotions, understand where each other are coming from, and see if you can work through it.
2 mics.
2 mics, all right, look at this. Try to approach the problem together. And say, like, okay, we're having a conflict here. Here's this problem we disagree on. Let's together as a team try to find a solution to this that's going to be workable for both of us.
So that sort of like segues into a question that I wanted to ask you about advisors. Do you recommend having advisors? If so, when do you think is the best time to sort of bring them into the company? Would you say that, maybe as early as possible, or would you say that there's sort of a better point? And, what kind of equity split do you think that they should get? And how have you worked that out in the past?
Yeah, like most of my answers, I think it's going to be, it depends. So all these are very context-dependent questions. For advisors, you want somebody who can help you at your current stage. So the answer to all of those questions you just asked me is yes. You want people in the early stages, early as possible, who can help you with the problems that you're facing. It's always great to have another mind there, or somebody who's seen the story a few times before to give you some advice. But you'll find that those advisors have limited lifespans often, that as your company continues to grow and scale and face different challenges, you want to be talking to different people. And with that in mind, think about how you want to compensate them. Some people are willing just to donate their time because they like you and they like working other people, you throw them a few bips of equity to kind of keep them along for the ride. For advisors who are purely in an advisor role, I wouldn't recommend giving away large amounts of equity. A little closer. Got it. You guys got me back there? All right, thank you. So it depends. There's a lot of people out there who are really willing to help if you ask. And a lot of people will do that without taking big chunks of equity in your company if that's how you decide to compensate them. But you want to have that conversation with a potential advisor, what their expectations are.
So how do you sort of make a decision about, like, what's sort of the average that you would give as far as equity to an advisor? I mean, again, it depends, but like, what have sort of you've seen?
Sure. If you're going to meet with somebody, once a quarter for a couple of years, something like that, I don't know, 20, 30 bips, so basis points, right? So fractions of a percentage is what I would be comfortable giving away there.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of a token of appreciation. You don't want to give away so much that somebody who's looking at your cap table is going to say, like, well, you gave 0.5% to this person who you talked to for 20 minutes every quarter. What's going on here? And so you want to avoid the eyebrow raise from a potential investor. But otherwise, whatever you feel comfortable with and what you can agree to.
Okay. And so let's talk about when you are having conversations with advisors or with investors, and you need to sort of divulge sensitive information. How do you protect yourself, and do you even need to, as far as like the information that you present to, whether that's advisors or investors or anybody really? Like, how do you protect yourself in that capacity?
Sure. So intellectual property is a big can of worms here for sure. I think as a founder, one of your jobs is to understand what your IP strategy is. So whether you are leaning on patents or trade secrets or whatever it happens to be to protect your secret sauce, and be aware of that when disclosing. For patents, you want to make sure you don't eliminate the possibility of patenting something, so you don't want to publish or you don't want to offer something for sale. You can talk to your lawyers to get more information on the specifics of what triggers those potential disclosures. For trade secrets, it's a little easier. There's no government body you have to deal with to get a trade secret. You have to keep it secret. You have to make sure that people know that it's a secret. It has to be marked as a secret. And so when you're talking to potential investors, for example, no VC is ever going to sign an NDA, so you have to be careful. And it's a judgment call of how much you disclose and whether there are parts that you might reserve until later. So I think it is reasonable to say, here we're going to talk about some stuff here. These are trade secrets. There's this very particular piece here that we can talk about later under NDA if you're interested in investing and moving forward here. But you have to give somebody enough information for them to understand what's going on. Maybe you don't tell them exactly how that particular secret works, but you can tell them what it does and how it creates value. It really depends on who you're talking to, and keeping in mind that we have to be risk takers as entrepreneurs. And so if you ask your lawyer, like, what should I do? They're going to tell you that everybody needs to sign an NDA before you say anything to them, which is their job to give you the most conservative answer possible. But we have to make decisions on our own for how much risk we're willing to take, how much it's going to cost to enforce those secrecy provisions, and go from there.
Okay. And so do you have sort of like a protocol on how you do it, like personally, or is it, as you said, it's sort of contextual based? And
it's very contextual. As I've gotten more experience, I've gotten much more open with what I'm willing to disclose to potential customers and potential investors, because ideas aren't worth that much. It's all in the execution. So you want to be able to find people who can help you, and they can't help you unless you tell them what it is that you're working on and how it works and what they might be able to do to help you.
So do you, maybe before you start talking to anybody, do you sort of vet them out and decide on, if you're going to disclose this information?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't just walk up to somebody and say, like, let me tell you all of my secrets. It's a conversation. So it's an exercise in building trust and understanding, like, is this somebody that I'd be willing to take advice from or work with? It's kind of like dating. You're just sort of slowly revealing pieces as you both become more comfortable with each other. and try to suss out whether there's value for both of you in that exchange.
Is there particular criteria that you use? Like, is there something like in your head where you're like, as soon as someone says something, you're like, oh, that's a red flag, or this is like, they're going to pass go and
Sure.
continue?
I mean, for me, I experience it kind of as a gut instinct, but that's come from experience. But if I try to think through there and like, okay, what are the things that would become red flags for me? Inexperienced investors are something that I'm a little more hesitant with, and that's something that isn't immediately obvious. So you can look at people's track records, and if you're talking to an investor who has a portfolio and isn't willing to introduce you to their portfolio companies, like that starts to make me a little nervous. This starts to become more of a conversation about what do I look for in investors, and it's very much like a hiring process for me. I think about who would I like to work with, who do I feel like I can trust, who can provide value beyond the money. The money's the easy part. It's everything else that comes along with it that is much more challenging in my experience.
So do you find, like, let's just say, for example, there's an investor's like that's really excited about you and is prepared to cut you a check. Would you, in some sort of circumstances, actually say no? Or because sometimes it's so hard to raise money, and so if someone comes along and is just like, okay, here, just take money and go, it's sort of like, it feels like I don't know, is it the right thing to do? Because it sort of feels like, okay, well, thank God someone's giving me some money to get going.
It can be.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends. You have to ask yourself, how bad do you want the money? There's a lot of money out there. There's a lot of investors. It takes time and effort to get in front of them, to get those term sheets. And so you have to make a decision. This deal that's in front of me, do I take it or do I not take it? The fact that someone is offering you money is usually a good sign. You're like, okay, well, I should probably take this. But don't be afraid to walk away if something doesn't feel right about the deal, or you feel like, I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, or I feel like I'm making this choice out of desperation. But again, that comes back to, how bad do I need the money?
Okay. And so how have you been able to keep yourself in a position where you're not so desperate that you need this check so badly that you're willing to like make a bad deal? What have you done to get yourself out of that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten easier as I've gotten further along in my career because I have more financial stability in my personal life to be able to lean on there. So that's certainly a helpful thing. If you're just getting started or you don't have some personal savings to lean on there, that might push you more in that direction of like, yeah, the money's here, I'm going to take it. I need the cash flow. I need to get started on this. You just want the experience. There's no perfect deal. A lot of founders will really dig into the dilution aspect of this and say like, oh, I'm not willing to give up this much of my company. Maybe I'm going to try to tough it out for a little longer. I think people are way too concerned with dilution. That unless you're really getting gouged, like, take the money.
Okay. That's good to know. So I also wanted to get a sense of like, I wanted to ask you a question about when you're picking team members, because I mean, some of the things that I've been seeing as far as like when I've been talking to VCs and investors, and they talk a lot about the team as being the most important thing, not even the IP or anything else. So what have you been able to develop as far as maybe a gut instinct when you're looking to hire people? I was at a discussion yesterday, and they talked about the fact that they brought their whole dev team in-house, and they felt like for them that was the best way to go. What have you been able to do?
Yeah, bringing your dev team in-house, I think, is usually a good idea for a tech company. You want to have that expertise as part of your team. If we're talking just founding team here, which is part of that early stage funding discussion, so to take a step back, if we're talking about early stage companies, investors mostly look at the team. There's not a lot of track record there in terms of the actual execution of the company itself. You guys have great ideas, we like the team, all right, we're going for it, kind of gut instinct investors. It's not until you have revenue numbers that you can point out that somebody's going to build a spreadsheet and try to understand whether that fits into their investment criteria. So team really is, in my opinion, the most important thing in an early stage company. So when I think about building out a founding team, I try to be very honest about what I bring to the table, what my strengths and weaknesses are, and who's going to complement me for the particular challenge that we're facing. So if our company is working on something over here and I know I can handle half of it, I'm going to find somebody who lives and breathes that other half. But that's really only part of the story. It also has to be somebody that you get along with, that you feel like you can trust, that you can build that working relationship with. If it's somebody that you worked with in the past and so you know you can work with them, that's usually a great thing to be able to have. But I don't think that's a necessary component in a founding team. I've seen a lot of people who have come together for the first time and be successful, but you have to be careful about who you're choosing and making judgment calls on that relationship, because you're going to be working with them for a long time.
Okay. And so how do you sort of like figure out, I mean, the other question then is also, let's just say, for example, it's not someone that you've ever worked with before. Do you go, one of the things that I had heard was if you go after a B level, you'll end up with a C level team. So do you, like, when you're trying to find these people, do you go after like the best possible person?
Absolutely.
Okay. And how do you, but like that person is often the most expensive. So how do you navigate through that? Like, do you make sure that you've raised enough capital first to be able to attract that person? And if so, like, how do you navigate through that? Right?
Sure.
Because, as you said, it's the most important thing, but the best person for the job is often the most expensive. So how do you attract that person?
In my mind, best person for the job and most expensive doesn't necessarily correlate. That if you're talking about people who are expensive in public labor markets, or they're at some big tech company and they're making $500,000 a year, they might be perfect from a technical perspective to help you. They might not have the right mindset to work in a startup. So particularly for founders and for early stage employees, you want people who are mission driven, that they're not doing it for the cash in the beginning. They're doing it for a sense of purpose and working on a problem that they care about. They're doing it for the potential upside of their equity, and that's kind of how you solve some of that expensive problem. That's what the equity is for. Because as an early stage, you want people who are willing to make the financial sacrifice and take a lower salary or no salary at all in the beginning to be able to work on something that they care about, to be able to build some sense of ownership, to be able to craft something that in the future hopefully will have an outsized return compared to their other options, or they're just doing it for fun. And I might be a little broken, but I think this is all fun now. So taking these big risks and saying like, we're not going to see any cash from this for a year and a half. Like, it's going to be fine. We're making a long-term play here. I think it's fun. And you want people in that same mindset, ideally. I think they make the best partners because everyone is doing it for the same reasons there. Like, if you have somebody who's worried about making their mortgage payments and they can't afford to step down from their current lifestyle or their current salary, even if they're a great technical fit, I don't think they're the right person to hire.
And so speaking of that, how do you decide on when it's time to sort of, if you're not making your milestones, like when is it time to say, maybe this is not working? Have you said that ever before?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
I think most of my projects, never quite make it off the ground there. So there's a lot of, is it the right time to quit? And I start getting into projects in that mindset as well, where I think, this is an interesting idea. Okay, and I'll start researching, start doing some viability testing and looking for reasons to not do it. And when I run out of those reasons, that's how I end up incorporating and starting things. And like, okay, well, couldn't find a reason to quit. Guess I'm doing this. But I think it's important to look carefully and objectively about the challenges that you're facing. If you're talking about like, we're going to run out of money, that's what your investors are for. Like, investors should be a backstop for you in bad times. In good times, they're sparring partners. They're there to cheerlead and to help you solve problems. But part of their job is also to say like, okay, I've seen this movie a few times before. I know what to do when this happens, or when this happens, or when this happens, where if it's an existential threat to your company, you want investors that you can lean on as partners in those bad times. Like, I see a lot of founders who are afraid of giving bad news to their investors. It's my instinct now to be more transparent than I was before. That I want my investors to know as early as possible if things are starting to seem maybe this isn't going quite in the direction that we wanted to. So let's get together as a team and figure out what it is that we can do about this. And, when you want to feel like you're all in the boat together, not that you're out there rowing by yourself and like the big bad investors are going to be mad at you if you're not making money. So team. Everybody's in it together. Thinking about picking investors, that's kind of the quality that I look for. Is I want somebody who feels like a partner and who's going to help if things don't go as planned, because they rarely do.
Yeah. And is there a particular time, like yesterday I was listening to someone who was saying that basically the bank starts revoking your line of credit if you get to a point where you're only at 2 months worth of runway. What's your sort of cutoff? Like, where do you find, like, you're like, oh, we need to start really buckling down? What's that look like for you?
It depends. It depends on how you're keeping track of that and how you know things aren't going in the right direction.
How do you know? How do you know?
If it's say like a SaaS business, you can look at your metrics and you can measure it. You can look at benchmarks of other companies and what their growth rates have looked like, and try to compare yourself to other companies. It's more art than science for some of us. Sometimes it's just kind of gut instinct. If you can try to use analytics and numbers to look at your growth or the lack thereof, like that's an interesting thing. If you're running into challenges with product market fit, you want to ask yourself, what's not working here? Go talk to your customers and say, what do you like? What don't you like? Why isn't this solving your problems? The purpose of the startup in the beginning is to find product market fit, and sometimes you don't. And so you get to a point where it's like, okay, we got 3 months of money left. If you don't think you're going to find the answer to those problems, have a conversation with your investors and say, together, let's make a decision. Do we want to spend the rest of this money trying to find product market fit, or do we want to call it quits, give the money that's left back to your investors and try something else? And I think you're going to earn a lot of points and a lot of respect from your investors if you come to them with that and say, here's the challenge that we're facing. I'm starting to think like we might have missed here, so let's think about it together, what we want to do to move forward.
Okay. And so on that sort of note, like, what is some questions that you feel like you wish you had asked when you were starting out that you didn't, and you now kind of regret that you
Sure.
had?
A lot of it is around like with what happens when it goes wrong.
Okay.
I think I was fairly naive, like a lot of first-time founders, of like, well, everything is going to go right. I'm going to crush it. It's going to be amazing. No. Things always go wrong. So now I want to understand from investors how they handle that situation. Like, is this somebody who has the emotional maturity to help coach a founder when things are going wrong, and to not just yell and scream at them and say, like, why are you wasting my money? We're in this as a team together. Like, how are you going to help me if things don't go wrong? What are the resources that you have to lean on? When things are going well, great. But what really kind of separates investors in my mind is how they handle when things go wrong. You can get at that from talking with some of their portfolio CEOs and say, like, how has this investor helped you when things went wrong? What are the challenges that you faced together? Like, were they there for you? Do you feel like you're going off to battle with them? You feel like they've got your back? And if they kind of hem and haw and be like, well, like we have their money, and like they kind of give us a phone call every once in a while, that's a red flag for me.
And so, like, in terms of like, you're working a lot of hours, how do you deal with burnout? I know, I had a situation where I was completely bedridden for 2 weeks and was just completely burnt out. How do you deal with that?
Sure, yeah. So this is something that I, having also experienced some burnout, care very deeply about. That in my mind, burnout and depression are the same thing. Like, there's a lot of contention over this amongst people who study these things, but for me, that emotional state is kind of the same. That you're anxious and hopeless, and you just don't want to get out of bed, and like everything sucks, and nothing's ever going to work. And learning to deal with those emotions, I think, is part of the job description of an entrepreneur. That because we are taking bigger risks than most people, we have bigger emotional swings that come along with that. And so I think part of being an entrepreneur is building self-awareness and really focusing on your inner world and trying to understand what's going on. Like, I'm feeling these things, to learn to accept that those are the emotions that you're experiencing, and to learn how to move forward. I find a lot of that comes from a fear of failure. That's something that I think also kind of drives us as well as entrepreneurs, that we want to win. We want to be able to build something great. We want to be able to change the world. Like, that's somehow baked into us. And like, I don't know why it's there, but that seems to be in all of us. And so learning to deal with that fear, I think, is part of the journey of entrepreneurship. I'm reminded of an allegory that somebody told me one time, that there's like a World War II soldier who's pinned down from machine gun fire with his platoon there. They're trying to take this hill with a machine gun nest on it, and he's thinking to himself, I'm terrified. What am I going to do here? I'm supposed to be up there. I can't really get up or turn around. But he decides that he's going to act courageously, and he wants them to find his body with the bullet holes in the front. And so that's become a bit of a mantra for me. So I remind myself when I'm facing a challenge where I feel afraid, bullet holes in the front. And it helps, right? And I think that's part of our job as leaders, as entrepreneurs, is to learn to accept the anxiety that comes with this risk-taking. And that's part of our job as well, is to create a safe place for our team to not feel as much of that fear, and to allow them the safe place to be able to go and to execute and build amazing things. So for us, it's part of the job description, unfortunately.
And do you have like sort of a work-life balance? Like, do you have a way in which like I've seen some founders that are just like, buried in their computer, for hours on end. And were you like that in the beginning?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did you kind of get yourself out of that?
It was a slow transition, but I try to treat it like any other job now, that I make a conscious choice to stop working at some point and say, there's an infinite amount of work to do. If I don't get it all done today, it's fine. Like, there's tomorrow, the day after that, I'm going to keep working. And that by helping to provide more balance there, by making that conscious choice, I get more productive. And like, that was a very counterintuitive thing for me in the beginning, was if I push myself that hard, sure, in the short term, maybe I can get a lot done, but then I start reaching into that burnout territory. And so having that balance is something that is a conscious choice for me, that is still difficult. Like, I still have to tear myself away from my laptop and be like, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to go for a walk, I'm going to go do something other than work, because of that drive of like, I want to win. I just want to like keep working on this. But at some point I can tell I start thinking myself in circles and reading the same paragraph over and over again. I'm like, okay, it's time to step away. But I try to drive it from, I work when I want to work, I play when I want to play. It's less structured than a 9-to-5 job. So I work strange hours compared to other people. In the morning, like, I might not work at all, but then I might work from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night. For me, that's often some of my most creative time. And so I think building self-awareness around what works for you, how do you feel good about yourself, how can you get your job done and still enjoy the rest of life, is an important thing to figure out, and part of the journey as well.
So my last question for you, what is one piece of advice that you would like to leave everybody with today?
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered a little bit of that in just the last answer there. Physical exercise, I did not really appreciate as being so important to work until the last few years, where I made an effort to do it more often than I was before, which is basically never. But I think better, I'm more calm. The impact that has had on my life has been tremendous. So take the time out of your day, like, instead of answering emails for another hour, go for a run, go surf, go to the gym. It's going to really help in ways that I think are a little unexpected at times, if it's not something that you've incorporated into your life before.
Thank you so much for everything.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This is fun.
Great shot. That was a lot of really helpful information. We're going to open up to Q&A now. This is not a great time to talk about your burnout story and why you got burned out, but this is a great time to ask some thoughtful questions about startup and what it's really like to run a startup. So I'm going to give the microphone to John. We have a short cord here, so raise your hand. Come on up here. If you have a question, come up here and we'll have you ask from up on the stage, next to the stage.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question. So you've actually gone through the process of building and selling a few companies.
Sure.
I think a lot of things that people think when they begin, first-time entrepreneur, I have $1 billion idea, this is going to sell for $1 billion. When you actually sold some of your companies, did the final sale of them look much different in the end than you thought it would in the beginning?
Every time.
And I'm just curious, how did you know it was time to sell, and what was the difference, and how did you know?
Sometimes you get an offer you can't refuse. In my case, Google showed up and said, you guys should come do this in Google. He said, okay, yeah, done. Other times, there are financial considerations to be made. Sometimes you're just kind of done and you want to work on something else, so it's time to sell. The story of selling your company for $1 billion, it happens every once in a while. Most companies don't sell for anything near that. The way companies are valued, the early stage is a little all over the place, but as you become more of a mature company, there are more structured ways of understanding how to value a company. And so you can kind of have a mental idea of how much you're probably going to sell for. You have to make a decision. Is it time to sell? Is it not? Sometimes your investors make that decision for you. Other times, you might take the risk of continuing on for a higher valuation later. I think it's a good idea when you're starting a company to try to have a realistic idea of what success looks like for you. I want $10 million out of this thing. Okay, well, if that's your goal, you can kind of chart your way along and know, if we sold now, it'd come out somewhere around there. Or if you really want to take something to IPO, that's a different path and a different strategy. And so it really depends on your own personal goals and what it is that you want out of the experience, and how to weigh the risks associated with that as well. The bigger rewards are much riskier for sure. And so depending on your strategy of, I'm going big, or I can do this again, so I'll take a smaller reward now and go do it again and again and again and again. It depends on what you find fun and what it is that you want out of the journey.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, so my question was about, it's really loud right there. My question was about sort of that intuition you had talked about. If you're being approached by someone who, they're offering something, they're asking for something, going into it with a little bit of hesitation, just not sure why exactly, and not necessarily bringing a lawyer into it. But my question was, what do you advise in terms of going to that meeting? And would you say, let's just bring the NDA agreement and present it to them? What would you say as far as tone?
Yeah,
to that meeting?
never walk into a VC's office holding an NDA. You will get turned around and kicked out very rapidly. Most professional investors, if you ask them for an NDA or to sign an NDA very early on, they're going to take it as a sign of being an amateur. And so in terms of signaling your professionalism, trust them sort of in the beginning and kind of ease your way into it. When you get to a certain point where you're like, okay, look, my lawyer's really going to kill me if you don't sign this NDA because here's this thing we're going to patent, or here's as part of diligence you really want to understand some piece of this, okay, fine, sign NDA. But when you're just pitching, people will won't necessarily kick you out of the room, but their brains are going to turn off. And some of that is the competition from other entrepreneurs. If you have an idea, so do 10 other people, and that VC has probably seen the other 9, and none of them are going to ask to sign an NDA. So if you come in saying I'm going to tell you about this, but with some conditions, they're just going to move on to the people who are not asking them for that, because we are competing for money and with other entrepreneurs at some point there.
There was a second part to that.
Oh,
Sorry. So the other part of that I wanted to ask was, if they're not offering money, they're offering resources, and they're asking for equity. How would you approach that conversation? Really, I don't know that equity is appropriate for that. What about maybe a %? So how would you what's the tone you would bring to that?
It depends on how you're valuing that resource. If they're saying like, hey, I can set you up with a deal with Verizon for $500 million in revenue, like, yep, okay, cool. Like, how much do you want? It really depends. If they're vendors, I recommend against paying with equity. You're going to end up paying more than if you had raised money and then use that cash to pay those vendors. A lot of design firms or lawyers will sometimes ask for equity as compensation. You can do it if you're desperate, but I would use that as a last resort. Equity is your most precious resource.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. My son is about to start up, to create a startup, and with regard to equity in particular, I'd advise him that it's probably wise to start it as a C corporation rather than as an LLC. Would you concur with that?
If you're looking to raise money from angel investors or venture capitalists, absolutely. C Corp is kind of the only game in town because you need to have multiple classes of shares. So you need to have that provision for preferred shares for a professional investor to be interested in. So rarely an LLC will work, and there's ways of luring your way through that, but you want to make it easy. And so Delaware C Corp is not going to raise any eyebrows with any investor there.
Hi. I've been talking to a potential investor to invest on Double Door, and they asked, has any one of your advisors invested in your company if they believe in your idea and advising you? And we have 4 advisors, and none of them invest. So they said, if they don't invest, why should we?
Yeah, that happens sometimes.
But it seems like a lot of the advisors, they want to do business with you.
Right.
They advise you and they want you to pay them.
Yes.
Right. So what was the question?
What do you think? I mean, most advisors would not want to invest on your company, even though they believe in your company. They want to do business. That's my experience.
Then I don't think they're advisors at that point. Yeah. If they are there to help you and give advice every once in a while, help set up some deals, and they're doing it because they enjoy giving that advice, that's an advisor, and you might compensate them with some equity. If they want to do business with you, then they're either customers or strategic partners, but there's a different relationship to be had with them, and so you might want to have a conversation with those people and say, if you do want to do business with us, let's talk about doing business together. Or if you want to invest in this company, let's do that. Because I think that's an interesting concern that your potential investors are bringing up there, that they have somehow perceived your advisors as not advisors. And so digging into what's going on there, I think would be a valuable exercise.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Fernando, CPA. Thank you. Before I ask my question, real quick, gentleman in the front, if your son lives in California, don't open up a C Corp in Delaware, trust me. My question is this: earlier you mentioned that your team is a way to invest in, your team is a way to attract investors, but then later on you said you want to make sure you have enough capital to pay for the team. So it's kind of like chicken or egg.
So the difference there is founding team versus early employees. If you're talking about people who you're not paying or you're doing equity, your initial partners, that's usually who the investors are looking at most. So you have that initial team, you then raise money and you go hire your early employees there, or you've kind of hired them saying like, oh, we're going to raise, and if we raise, here's what we're going to pay you. So yes, there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem there, but you can get through that through this conversation, and you kind of stage it out a little bit.
So it's like equity competition versus actual money compensation.
That's right. So people who are receiving founder shares are going to be the people who own significant chunks of the company, and that's their initial compensation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I kind of got a side question.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the current trend at all of companies teaming up more along the benefit corporation side, where they have a profit side and a non-profit side, and they work the 2 companies together? If you are, could you?
I know that
That's an
people
insight?
do that. I don't know too much about the actual mechanics there, so I cannot offer any insight there. Other than what you just said, I know that people do that.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
true. Okay. I'll keep looking. Thanks.
Hi, so I know earlier you talked about finding the right teammate to you talk about finding someone that didn't have a mortgage. So wanted to see if you could define that a little clearer, because usually people that are past a certain age or a certain place in life might have a mortgage. So is the expectation that they move, get rid of the mortgage? I mean, how do you manage that or position that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit it on the head there, that as we move forward in our careers and we get older, we have more financial responsibilities, and it does get harder to take the risk, for sure. I think entrepreneurship has a reputation of being sort of a young person's game for that reason. The numbers don't quite support that. I think the last time I checked, the median age of entrepreneurship was mid-30s. So it's not just the 20-year-olds running around in hoodies that the media likes to make us believe. It's a very personal decision for everyone involved whether this is something that they really want to do. Some people take out second mortgages, some people sell their homes, some people move across the country. It really depends on the motivations of that particular person. Is this a problem that they care so much about working on that they're willing to make those sacrifices? And that's often what makes it challenging to find founders. And I think also what produces serial entrepreneurs to some degree, that once you've done it once before, it's a little easier the next couple of times, and you have more personal resources to lean on that allow you to take that risk again and again and again. So I see smaller founding teams from older entrepreneurs, maybe because of that reason. Just kind of thinking off the top of my head here of how I might explain that. But yeah, you have to be willing to take the risk, and that's a conversation between you and a potential co-founder. Is here's what we're thinking about. What are we giving up in order to take this? There's an alternative path that isn't as popular as the startup path, entrepreneurship through acquisition. So this is something that has been around for, 20 years or so, and is starting to gain popularity now, where particularly for older, more experienced professionals, you kind of team up with a mini private equity company and you go buy some quote-unquote boring business, like manufacturing, sometimes service businesses. But you can get a lot of the same experience of being an entrepreneur with significantly lower risk, because you're buying a company that's already established, has cash flow, and you're there to manage and grow it, rather than taking a substantial risk in the beginning trying to find product market fit and trying to build a new company. You can go find companies that people are willing to sell because they're retiring or they don't have anybody to pass the company on to. So it's a really interesting path for people who are more risk adverse than others, if you're still interested in entrepreneurship. I got some books I can recommend to you if you're interested. Great.
Hey, thanks for your talk. You mentioned about the team, like the difficulty, anxiety. So my question is, do you have, like, when you went through all this difficult journey, do you have your own the personal mentor? And if you have your personal mentor, of course you mentioned about finally, and heard your master and sentence to the audience is do physical exercise. I consider that one is also one of the one for you to recover from some of this thing here. And back to my question is, so if you have a mentor, how did you find your mentor?
Yeah, mentors come and go for me. That as I have moved through my career, I've moved through mentors as well, depending on where I was in my career, what I needed help with. But my general approach is, for the problem that I'm facing at that given time, find somebody who I can look at and say, you're really good at this thing. I'm going to buy you a beer and just ask you lots of questions. You don't walk up to somebody and say, can you be my mentor? Like, let me buy you a beer and we're just going to have a chat, and I want to understand how their mind works and build a relationship and start asking questions. People like to help. People like to mentor other people, especially if they're asked questions about something that they think that they're very good at as well. And so you can find people out there to ask detailed questions to. And it feels fairly informal, but that's been the best strategy that I've ever found is, invest in spending time with people who you think are good at the things you want to be good at, and see if you can glean some information just from talking with them or asking for help or working through a particular problem with them and say, like, okay, we've been hanging out for a little while, like I have this problem at work, like, can I get your advice on this over dinner sometime? And little one-off things like that. And it's not going to be one person that has all the answers for you. You're going to need a team of people, kind of your own personal board of advisors is how I kind of think about it.
Hey, Austin. Got a couple of questions for you. Regarding pivots and exits. So you were involved with 2 companies that had successful exits.
Mm-hmm.
One was sold to NVIDIA. The other company that you started at was sold to Google.
That's right.
You don't look that old, so I'm thinking that these companies were sold, without a long lead time or
That's
development.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were fairly rapid acquisitions for the technology and the team that we had built. We were pre-revenue on one of them, but at the end of the day, the process is the same. Build a good team, build a good product, build a good business. Exits will figure themselves out. So I always tell people not to plan for their exits. And in fact, if an investor asks me, what's your exit strategy? I kind of start rolling my eyes a little bit now. Our job as entrepreneurs is to build a good business, and the exits will figure themselves out. Pivots within that, I am starting to see the vocabulary change a little bit, which I think is really interesting, that instead of talking about pivoting now, it's become more of a continuous process. I'm thinking about growth hacking, which I'm not a huge fan of the phrase, but that's the extension of pivoting in my mind. That if you're thinking about pivoting every week, that's growth hacking. It's following the data, following the numbers and the growth, and trying to track your trajectory towards product market fit and growth as rapidly as possible. And so that's kind of built into the way that we run businesses now, in my mind.
And one last question.
Sure.
So the first company was a graphics company.
Mm-hmm.
Second was a cloud software company. And now you just started a new company that's an EQ company.
That's right.
I don't see a lot of overlap in the 3. Can you kind of talk about what your latest venture is? And
A little bit, yeah.
about
It's early days. We're working on a consumer app as an emotional intelligence training system. Emotions have been something that have had a profound impact on my life in the last few years. It's something that I've really spent a lot of time working on, and it's something that feels like there's a bit of a cultural trend, at least in California, around emotional wellness. So that's something that we're working on there. Not a whole lot to share there. We only got started about 2 months ago. So check back in. Give me a few more months, and I'll have a little beta test for anybody who's interested.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.